Hello, and welcome to the Students of the Word podcast. My name is Jacob Kennedy, and today we're going to be looking at some of the reasons, some of the examples and proofs that show that there is indeed a God, that He does indeed exist. The world in which we live today is one that is determined to ignore the existence of God, is determined to discredit as much as they can that there is a God, because to say that there is a God means that we are amenable to Him, we are accountable to Him. But when we consider the arguments for God, when we consider the fact that he does indeed exist, a man by the name of William Lane Craig wrote a book entitled The Five Arguments for God. And in his book, he offers a very succinct and very streamlined definition of the arguments that can be used to defend the existence of God. The five arguments he lists are the cosmological argument from contingency, the Kalam cosmological argument based on the beginning of the universe, as well as the moral argument based on the moral values and duties, and also the teleological argument, which is based on fine tuning. And finally, the ontological argument. All these different arguments can be used to show that there is indeed a God, but as we do not have time to go over all of them in this podcast, we will deal with just two, and those two being the cosmological argument and the moral argument. So let's begin by noticing the cosmological argument from contingency. When dealing with arguments, when dealing with the trying to prove that there is a God, it is wise to formulate our thoughts into a logical syllogism, which is simply two premises and a conclusion that follows from the premises. William Lane Craig lays out the premises or the syllogism for the cosmological argument as follows. He says that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is God. The universe exists. Therefore, the universe has an explanation of its existence, and therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Basically, what he is saying here is that since the world is contingent, since the universe has the nature of contingency, it demands that there must be someone who is not contingent, who is necessary, who has the nature of aseity, and that being God. We understand, though, that no contingency argument makes the claim that all things have to have a beginning. This is a dangerous realm into which trap rather, that some people fall into, that being to say that all things must be contingent. All things must have a cause, because to say that means that God must have a cause. But God exists in a different state. He is not contingent. And so when we make this argument, we need to be careful to emphasize that all things that are contingent in nature require a cause, require a significant, or an adequate cause. We look at the law of causality, which says every material effect has an equal or adequate cause. But one thing we must understand when we look at this is that we are focusing on the material. What we have for us in the material world. In other words, looking at these cameras or the iPad in front of me, they have to have a cause. Logically, we understand that they did not self-create. They did not appear out of nothing, but rather there had to be someone who designed and built them. We also look at the second law of thermodynamics, which shows to us that the universe is tending towards entropy. In other words, the energy and the matter that we have existing in our world today is getting less and less organized. It's getting more and more disorganized. And this shows that there had to be a point in which the maximum level of matter and energy in its most organized state existed. That being what we would refer to as the beginning. We also think about about Einstein's theory of general relativity. Now, this deals with how gravity relates to mass and energy. But when we look at Einstein's theory, he set about to prove that the universe is self-existent. In other words, he did not want to believe that God created the universe. He did not want to believe that the universe had a beginning. But as he looked at the evidence, as he examined what was around him, he realized that there was no other option, that the universe had to have a beginning. It had to come from somewhere. The universe is contingent in nature. It is inessential, if you will. It does not have to exist. But God, on the other hand, he is necessary. He has to exist in order for this world to exist. When we think about Exodus chapter 3 and verse 14, God describes himself as the I am. When Moses asks, "Who should I say send me?" God says, "I am send you." And this being the Hebrew phraseology to indicate the self-existent one. God is saying that he has no beginning. He will have no end, but rather he is always existed. He is the self-existent one. Princeton University's professor of philosophy, W.T. Stacy, wrote that everything that has a beginning has a cause. This world had a beginning. Even Immanuel Kant had to admit that a series of subordinate causes must end with an absolutely necessary cause, without which it would not be possible, or would not possess completeness, rather. We understand then that this world had to have a cause. It is not self-existent, but rather it requires there to be someone who is self-existent who created this world. We look at the qualifications for someone or for the being that would create this world. Number one being that he exists outside of this world. He exists with a different nature than this material universe. And what we see in John 4:24 is that God is a spirit. He is not physical. He is not material. He is of a different nature, of a different power level than anything on this earth, than anything in this universe. He is different. He is not material. But we also think about the fact that God does not have a beginning. We look at Psalm 90 and verse 2, which reads, starting in beginning of verse 2, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever thou hast formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, thou art God." In other words, God is everlasting. He has no beginning. He has no end. But the second argument we want to consider, the second proof that God exists, comes from the moral argument. Now, again, looking at a syllogism for this, Craig points out that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. What we're saying here is that if there are moral duties, if there is a moral standard, then there had to be someone to give that standard. Had to be someone to set about those morals. We look at our world today and we see that moral relativism is on the rise. People do not want to believe in a moral standard because that inhibits their ability to do what they want. And when we look at a world that is focused on moral relativism, though it is widely believed, this is often not widely practiced. We think about the toddler, the little child who gets his toys stolen by another child. And well, of course, he's going to scream out, "Well, that's not fair. That's my toy." Well, to that toddler, there is no such thing as a moral relativism, but rather a moral standard that it is not fair to take a toy from another person. It is not fair to take that which does not belong to you. Now, when we look at this as adults, or we look at this in society today, we think about the fact that while someone might claim to be a moral relativist, should he have his wallet stolen, he would not be okay with that. He would not say, "Oh, well, that's just that individual's truth. That's just the thief's moral truth." No, he would say that there is a moral standard, and by right, he would have every right to call the law in and to have him prosecuted for theft. When we think about this idea that murder, stealing, committing adultery, we understand that these things are all wrong. They're innately wrong, and we all can understand this. One very glaring example of immorality is that of the Nazi regime. There are few, if any, who would claim that the Nazis were morally upright, who were morally pure. Rather, they were, in fact, immoral. They committed genocide against Jews, blacks, homosexuals, the elderly, and any others that the regime determined were undesirable, were not conducive to producing the Aryan race or the superior race that Hitler so desired. But as World War II came to a close, as the Allied powers defeated the Axis powers, defeated Nazi Germany, and November 20th of 1945, the Nuremberg trials took place. The Nuremberg trials were held to prosecute the Nazis for war crimes. And in these trials, they realized they could not attack or they could not judge the Nazis based on Nazi law. Because according to the Nazi law, according to Nazi Germany's law, these soldiers, these officers were simply following orders. They were simply obeying the law of the land. And thus, if the law of the land determines morality, then they were perfectly moral in what they were doing, perfectly moral in the atrocities that they committed. But it was U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson who cited that, no, we can't argue against them on German law, but there is a higher law. There is a higher standard than any international law. And this higher law could be defined as the basic principles of jurisprudence, which are assumptions of civilization. Now, friends, let me ask you, if there is no such thing as a moral standard, then how can we have an assumption of morality? How can we have a moral understanding that is assumed in civilization? There has to be a standard. There has to be a morality that is innately within us as human beings. When we think about society, we think about what we are facing in this world today, especially in the United States. It is the case that the more we have strayed away from God, the further we have denigrated God, the more we have withdrawn ourselves from his standard, the more immoral this world has become. Even to the point that one today who's speaking the truth, is speaking his belief, which is a right defended by the Constitution, is murdered. He is assassinated for holding to a belief that is not someone else's. Friends, when we delve into moral relativism, when we accept moral relativism and deny a standard of morality, what we have is a chaotic world full of murder, full of things that should not be. A scary world to live in indeed. You know, it was C.S. Lewis during the time of World War II who wrote a book entitled Mere Christianity. And in this book, he lists some things in defense of the moral argument. And one thing he mentions is that law demands a lawgiver. We would not look at the U.S. Constitution and say, well, this just appeared out of nowhere, or this was subjective. No, there was a group of men who assembled together, who wrote out the Constitution, who argued over its points, its pros and its cons, if you will, and decided on what it would be, decided on the law of the land. And when we look at moral law, the fact that a moral law exists demands that there had to be a moral lawgiver. Of course, we know that lawgiver has to be God, for no human can truly set the standard for morality. And we think about some arguments that the atheists use. Some might say, well, morality exists, yes, but it's mere brain chemistry. It's completely subjective. Friends, we can't say this. Logically, we cannot conclude that morality is mere brain chemistry or a mere subjective truth, as it is innate within all of us. It is something that we all possess, is an understanding of morality. But when we consider what morality is, what it is not something that is arbitrarily determined. Rather, it is the characteristics of God. Who God is what morality is. We are to base our morality, base our standard on who God is, on what his traits are. To recap, we have considered two arguments for the existence of God: the cosmological argument from contingency and the moral argument. When we understand that this world has to have a creator, that it has to be caused by someone, we understand that God must exist. And when we understand that morality must exist, that morality does indeed exist, we have no other recourse but to admit that there is indeed a God, that he is alive, and that he is the standard. We thank you for joining us on this episode of the Students of the Word podcast, and we hope to see you back next time.